Can everybody hear me better? Okay, all right. I always have a tendency to go like this, and you don't hear me anyway. So I'll try and hold it up. There's a clip on. Yeah, Joe can wear that one because he's going to do all the talking. So a little bit about what we're going to cover today, just little introductions. I'm going to talk about the Cloud Graphite project, which is our internal code name for working on open source for cloud. Hand it over to Joe, and he's going to talk about all the work that he's done with ManageIQ. And then I'll kind of wrap it up with a little bit about Google Cloud Platform in general and why you might care about it. So for introductions, I'm Eric Johnson. I'm a tech lead manager over open source and Google Cloud Platform. I've been doing this for, I guess, about 3 years now at Google, maybe a little bit longer than that. Started off in the compute engine team as a go-to-market strategy, right? So we were very late to the game in infrastructure as a service, cloud. One of the ways that we're trying to play catch up is to make sure really popular open source projects can support Google Cloud Platform. So along the way, I've managed to contribute to a lot of different open source projects. I've been kind of doing this cloud thing for a little while, kind of bouncing across companies, but I found a good home at Google I don't think I'm going to leave. And you can find me on Twitter and GitHub at Google.
And can anyone hear me? Is this working? Okay, great. So I'm a software engineer at Google. I work underneath Eric. So I started working on the cloud initially in 2012 at AWS, and then I moved over to Google in 2015. I think my first ManageIQ pull request was like 2 or 3 months ago, I think. So that would be, so I wrote up their first open source contribution in 2006. There's a long period where nothing happened. And then I can count this year as my next contribution. So pretty good.
So, and also just to clarify, so Joe's been working on it for a couple of months, but Google's been involved with ManageIQ a little earlier than that. One of the ways that I've been successful with open source, and I guess I can segue into this a little bit, is 20% time. Everybody's heard about Google's 20% time, right? So we dig up some engineers to kind of help that have either passion with open source or they want to work on an open source project. So we have had a couple engineers working with ManageIQ prior to Joe, but Joe's a full-time employee working on ManageIQ right now. So Google loves open source. So I figured I'd just talk a little bit about Google's kind of how we use open source. So internally, right, we have data centers all over the planet, and they all run Linux. So everything we have internally all runs on top of Linux, so we're heavy users of open source software. Our development environment, we use open standard or open source programming languages for all of our development. There's 4, I think, gold languages that are supported within Google. There's Java, Python, Go, and C++. So those are the primary languages that are used internally. We also use open source like Eclipse, things like that. Everybody's development workstation has run some variant of Unix, right? And so pretty much every Google engineer knows how to use like sed and awk and all those fun things. So we're clearly like really heavy users in open source, and we do a lot of contributions back. So some of and we also believe in the open source model. So a lot of the things that we've done, we open source just right out of the box, right? So Android, everybody's familiar with that, and Chrome. Go started as, came out of Google. Kubernetes, if you've heard of that, is another open source project. There's quite a few others that we run out as just regular open source. Even the team that I work at internally within Google is builds all of our internal development infrastructure tooling. We open sourced a version of our build system called Bazel. So that's an open source project that we've contributed. But where does that kind of meet with the Red Hat, right? So ManageIQ, obviously we're here for that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what we've done on that. I've been contributing to Ansible for the last, 2.5 years, I want to say. Not doing a stellar job, but there are modules out there that let you use Google Compute Engine with Ansible. And then obviously OpenShift Origin with Kubernetes, you know about, I'm sure. So with that, I'll pass it over to Joe. You've got your own mic.
I need to. Oh, you want your clicker. Okay, hey everybody. So really quickly, I wanted to highlight sort of, I guess, my journey on this project, where I started, what I worked on, sort of the challenges that I faced as a developer. on this, what we actually accomplished. So I want to give a highlight of sort of the challenges that I faced, what I implemented, and sort of the results that came out of that. So before we get started, I want to give you an idea. Oh, is it still not working? That's way easier. Is this better? Okay, I'll try not to drop the mic as I talk. So yeah, I've got a background in enterprise software. Now, what do I mean when I say enterprise software? Normally, when you hear enterprise, you think of that, as the sales term, large software that's for enterprise companies for managing things. I'm kind of using it in sort of the way we use it as developers, which means pretty complicated, unnecessarily, complex software that people have worked on. Specifically, people might not be surprised to say or to learn that I worked on Java. That's my background. Java and enterprise go together very well. So when I say that I worked on enterprise software, my bread and butter was basically making lots and lots of classes. Classes and impls and factory impls. And I'm sort of presenting this as a contrast to how most Ruby developers work. This was actually quite a challenge for me when I first started this project. And I also want to give an example of sort of what I think a great example of enterprise software is. And you guys might already have seen this, but does everybody know what FizzBuzz is? Have you guys heard of the FizzBuzz programming problem? It's very, very simple. The idea is it's supposed to be like a weed out question so that any developer worth their salt should be able to solve this. You print the numbers 1 through 100. If it's a multiple of 3, you print fizz. 5, you print buzz. 3, 5, print FizzBuzz. Seems pretty straightforward. And up there, I put some Ruby code for the Ruby audience here so we can read it. Some engineers would be able to read that a little bit easier. Note that I copied that off the internet. I was not confident enough to implement it myself and put it on the slide and have somebody point out an error. That would be quite devastating. So the reason I bring this up is because there's something on the internet called FizzBuzz Enterprise Edition. So you guys may have seen this before, but I'll quickly read the tagline under there. It says, FizzBuzz Enterprise Edition is a no-nonsense implementation of FizzBuzz made by serious businessmen for serious business purposes. And I just think this is just like a perfect example of what ends up happening when you're working on enterprise software. Not directly. Nobody goes out of their way to kind of code this way on purpose. Well, okay, maybe a few people do. But nobody sane does that. And but it just ends up happening, and especially when you're working in large companies on Java. And this is primarily what I've done. And I'm just going to walk through here really quick because it's pretty great. I don't know if you can see that folder there at the top, but it's a Spring configuration. If you're familiar with Java and Spring, you know that already we've lost. It's very, very complicated. And remember, this is solving FizzBuzz. So if we go into source, you can see the long main package name, and there's tests. Oh, that doesn't look too unreasonable. If we go into the main package name, oh, we've got impls and interfaces. Okay, somebody's following best practices for test injection, I guess, and mocks. And if we go into interfaces, oh my gosh, aren't we solving FizzBuzz? What is going on here? We've got factories, loop, parameters, printers, strategies. And just for fun, I went into the factories directory just to show you an example of the kind of classes that I work on. We've got is evenly divisible strategy factory, string printer factory, string returner factory. Don't ask me why there's 2 strings in there. Again, this is a joke, right? Most software is not this crazy. Enterprise software is not this crazy. But this is what it feels like often as an enterprise developer. You work on code that's very, very complicated, and it's part of a large, large team. And so you end up working on this very small component, and it's so easy to make things complicated, especially in Java. This was my background coming into this project. I think you guys can already see that I'm going to have a little bit of trouble working on Ruby because Ruby developers do not code this way. And I wish I had a lot more time to talk about sort of the interesting contrast that I faced when I went from Java to Ruby, because there's just so many advantages of Ruby that I found that kind of highlight why you don't have to code that way in enterprise software. Like, you can just let data be data, for instance. You don't have to make new classes for every possible type of data object. You can just use a map of maps of sets and anything like that. Whereas when you do that in Java, it's difficult, so everybody makes their own types, and then all these types are slightly different, and you spend all your time writing code that just sort of adapts between things, and you end up with string returner factory. So going into this project, this was sort of my background. Eric came to me and told me, Ruby on Rails is sort of what I'd be working on a Ruby on Rails project. I don't know if you guys can read this quote. I'll read it out loud, even though it's quite embarrassing. So me, 10 years ago, that was my only experience with Ruby on Rails. That's the last time I touched it. My quote was, "Ruby on Rails seems pretty neat, but I think I'll stick with PHP." I'm glad I didn't. as we've all found, PHP can be somewhat lacking as a language. I know there's still lots of development there, but yeah, that was sort of me 10 years ago, and it's important to admit when you're wrong. I'm admitting that now. So I'm going into this project, and Eric tells me let's get started on this, and I pick up my first task. And what's the first thing you do when you start a new unfamiliar language with a new familiar project? If you said, learn the language and do the proper idioms, you're right. That's not what I did. What I did was I said, okay, how would I write this in Java? I sat down, wrote it out in Java, and then basically translated that to Ruby. And as you guys can expect, that is not the right way to write Ruby code. One of the most common messages that I think I got on my pull request was not idiomatic, which was a good point. And also, I put up here that this McBot character commented a lot on my stuff. He really likes aligned hash rockets. And, surprisingly, I learned a lot from that robot. Yeah, so that's actually great because that's actually where I'm going with this next step here. As I was working on this, this is not the way to write code, and this actually led to a lot of struggle at the beginning for me. The only reason I succeeded was because of the community. That's everyone in this room. Up here, I've got a picture of the Gitter page, right, where everybody's sort of chatting. And I remember when I first got introduced to this, I was kind of like floored. It was just amazing. I could just go in here, point to any room, or go to any place there and ask a question, and people would answer within minutes. These were developers. This wasn't me having to talk to managers or go through lots of different channels. These are developers, and even better, they're also users. I've seen users come in and ask questions before in there, and that's just like one of the great advantages of open source software is that you've got both developers and users. And one of the great things too is that developers are users and users are developers. You just get this direct line of communication to both your users and developers, and when you do that, software just grows. It grows in an awesome way, right? This was super helpful for me to come in here. I think I was harassing Adam. I don't know where Adam is in the audience, but unfortunately, I think if he was super unproductive this quarter, it was my fault. I was pinging him constantly. Yeah. So really quickly, I want to highlight some of the additions we've got in here for the Google provider. We've got up here a screenshot of being able to manage instances. We can do all the standard power operations. You can see I've got some instances in there with different operating systems. You can also do lifecycle and provisioning. And then we also hooked up the event catcher so that when people make changes to your ManageIQ project outside of ManageIQ, things can come in. I really quickly wanted to highlight this though, because I felt like this was a pretty interesting use case here, and it actually worked very well with the Google Cloud. Up here, I've got an example of some of the events that GCP will show you when you log in. It's using a tool called Google Stackdriver. And the cool thing is that every one of these events is like a raw API call that a customer or a client or something did. I've only put a few of the items up here, the data items that are up here, but you can actually grab all sorts of interesting things like user agent, time. You can see when the operation was initiated, when it completed. And of course, you can see the operation types up there. I've got insert, delete, stop. So when we hooked this up to ManageIQ, the main thing we did was if any compute instance changes outside of ManageIQ, end up notifying ManageIQ so it knows to refresh its state. But you can just see the potential for all sorts of really interesting use cases here based on this data, right? You could have things that say, okay, if somebody provisions an instance outside of ManageIQ, send an email or automatically apply some firewall rules to it, right? Unless it's got some sort of permission, you shouldn't be able to, nobody should be able to log on to it, for example. And I know there's potential with Automate to do a lot of this. And so it's actually, I thought it was a really interesting example of how GCP fit really well with ManageIQ. Oh, and then as another aspect of implementing this, we had to implement support for Google PubSub, which is, if you're familiar with AWS, it's very similar to SQS. It's basically a messaging system between two components so that they can pass messages to each other. It's often used for jobs. As part of implementing that, we were using the Fog client. We found the Fog client didn't have support. One of the great things about open source is I could just sit down over a couple of days, add a pull request for this Fog client and send it out. And then within another few days, it was checked in, and they had released a new Ruby version. Or sorry, a new Gem version. So we were able to hook that into ManageIQ and get that working. And so I want to highlight, not only was that really fast, and I wish we could move that fast within, in enterprise software, but not only was it really fast, but now Fog has Google PubSub support. So as part of doing this, I was able to give back to the community in a little way. Anybody who uses Fog now can start using this. And that feels really good as a developer. That's one of the awesome things about working on open source is that people are benefiting from what you do. And then finally, before we get out of here, I want to show sort of what you do when you need to add a Google provider to ManageIQ, if anyone wants to try this out. So you can go to cloud.google.com to go ahead and give this a shot. That's the only thing you need to remember. You get a $300 free trial, so that's pretty good for experimenting. You can launch instances and do all sorts of stuff. This is what the page looks like, in case anybody needs to know what that looks like. When you log in there, one of the things that's a little bit confusing for newcomers is that there's this idea of projects. So projects are just a way of compartmentalizing your resources. If you're using AWS a lot, you don't have anything like projects in AWS. But in GCP, before you can create anything, you sort of have to create a project that sort of encapsulates all your stuff, I guess. A good example of this would be if you were working on ManageIQ, like I do, you would have ManageIQ-dev, ManageIQ-prod, ManageIQ-stable, ManageIQ, this one's really working, that sort of thing. That's sort of how my development practice usually goes, lots and lots of copies. So yeah, you'll create a project there, and then there's these little windows here that tell you how to get started. These are tutorials that show you how to use the service. I highly recommend you do that. But if you're just trying to get this working with ManageIQ, what you're going to want to do is create a service account. And the way you'll do that is you'll see this add credentials to your project. It can get a little confusing because there's many different ways to interact with GCP, so I just want to really highlight that you need to click on that service account button. That's a service account, if you're familiar with AWS or any other provider. It's basically a public key and a private key. So Google uses OAuth for doing a lot of this, so that's why it gets a little complicated. But a service account, you can just think of that exactly as credentials that you would use in any other provider. Go ahead and create one of those. It'll take you to this page where you can manage your service accounts. The only important thing, you can name it and do whatever, but the only important thing you need to do is furnish a new private key, because you can't log in without credentials. Say you want it in JSON, download it, and then within ManageIQ, all you need to do is go ahead and paste the contents of that JSON file in there, give it your project name, hit validate, and you'll be good to go. So what's coming next? So on my laptop, I've got some testing code that is in various states of brokenness right now. But we've got sort of an example of metrics coming through there. So you can see CPU metrics for instances within GCP. We're also bringing in disk and network so that you can get the exact same access to metrics that you get at the console within ManageIQ. Virtual machine service account support. So what is that? That's if you're deploying this instance on GCP, you can leverage what's called the virtual machine service account, which is a service account that's associated with the machine. It's sort of an easier way of being able to access GCP without having to manage credentials manually, being able to add and delete and move them around. But the big win is if you're a customer, you just launch this on GCP, say, hey, I'm running in GCP, it auto-detects that, adds the credentials, and you're good to go. You don't have to do any of that service account stuff we saw. And finally, we're going to add ManageIQ to the Cloud Launcher. So Cloud Launcher is a little feature in GCP where you can go create an instance that's automatically running some service. It's already pre-configured for you. You just give it a few interesting information like username and password, launch that, and there it goes. And then at the end here, I've got insert desired feature here. Please tell me if you guys are really interested in some particular feature. I'd love to talk about it. Please tell me if I've added any bugs that have broken you horribly. I'd also like to hear about that. But yeah, I'm always interested in hearing about features. And one of the great things, too, about working with open source is that everybody in here is a developer and a user, and so I can get lots of interesting feedback. Up here, I've got a quote from Eric Raymond. He wrote stuff in the Cathedral and Bazaar, which is a bunch of essays about open source. Really recommend you read that if you haven't read that before. But what he writes is, the next best thing to having good ideas is recognizing good ideas from your users. Sometimes the latter is better. And I think that's so true with open source software because that's one of the greatest things, is that you've got users and developers just coming together and working on it. And users are developers and developers are users. It's really awesome. It's something you don't see in that awful enterprise world I showed at the beginning. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Eric. Thanks for listening to me talk, and thanks for helping build that community that helped me succeed.
Okay, so a little bit of marketing stuff, I guess, just to give raise awareness. So before I start going through this, give an idea of like how fast I can go through here. How many people know like what Google Cloud Platform consists of? Anyone? Yeah, small handful. How many people think it's App Engine? Okay, so more than App Engine. All right, that's good. I guess. So I'll leave this up there. I'm not going to walk you through everything in here, but I'll tell you a little bit of a story. So I've been doing this for, like I said, 3 years. When I first got started doing this, one of the projects I contributed to were Vagrant, Packer, and Terraform, HashiCorp tools. Does anybody have any familiarity with those? Yeah, great. So the guy that started all of that, Mitchell Hashimoto. So the first time I interacted with Mitchell was on GitHub, I don't know, 3 years ago, and it was to add a plugin for Vagrant for spinning up a virtual machine on GCE. So my first pull request over to Mitchell was to add this Google provider. And so the comment that I got back from Mitchell was, hey, thanks, but Vagrant's more about spinning up VMs, not App Engine provisioning, so close my pull request and move on. So I was like, no, wait, we actually have like virtual machine service, right, called GCE. It's more than just App Engine. Please take a look. And he did, merged it in, so we finally got that in. So then about maybe a year or so later, I went and added support for Packer. And this time around, Mitchell was like, okay, yeah, I remember there was like some kind of virtual machine thing or something or that or whatever. So he went ahead and like didn't close the pull request on me that time, so actually got that added in relatively easily, but I still had to kind of do all the work myself. Moved that forward like another year and a half later, and when Terraform came out, he actually did the first pass at the Google Cloud Provider driver for Terraform. So since then, we've picked it up and we've moved it along forward. But I thought it was a really great story in terms of, from my perspective, right, the evolution awareness of GCP getting out there. So over the last, 2, 3 years, 4 years now, we've grown a long way. So when we first started doing this, obviously back in 2007, we had just App Engine. I think it was 2013, we had GCE became generally available. We also had Google Cloud Storage, which is, if you're from the Amazon world, is S3. And then over these last years, we've been adding more and more stuff. And I think that one of the things that I would highlight is a lot of this stuff, well, all of this stuff is built on top of Google's infrastructure. So if you're thinking about like, why would I look at some of this stuff? It's because we're running this on top of the same infrastructure that you may use for Gmail, YouTube, Maps, all of our networking. We're using some of the same technology that we use internally for routing requests all over these services, all over the planet. We've got a lot of differentiated services, I would say, and which you wouldn't find elsewhere in other cloud providers. If you take a look at our big data, I was actually going to use a little red thing here. So BigQuery, that's one of the things, one of my favorite things to talk about. This is also a little story about how Google is evolving with cloud. Way back in the day, 2002, something like that, we published white papers on GFS and MapReduce, Bigtable. People went off and thought, oh, that's brainy stuff, and we'll create an open source reference implementation, and out pops Hadoop, right? And there's this massive ecosystem around that. So fast forward, 10 years, we want to do cloud too, and we're recognizing like, oops, we really screwed up. So when we decided that we were going to launch Bigtable ourselves, our internal version of Bigtable had moved so far past what the open source reference, the open source implementations of Bigtable, that they're basically incompatible, right? We had to write like H-base adapters and things like that to make it accessible. So we're learning our lesson that open sourcing things first rather than publishing a white paper is a better way to go. So that's why you see things like Kubernetes and TensorFlow and Bazel. That's where, rather than writing a white paper about it, we're actually just going to head and open source a project that way. One of the big barriers to adoption, I think, in GCP for a long time has been missing some of these enterprise features, not to reuse Joe's term. So identity access management was something that we just recently rolled out, and we're actually improving it along the way as we go. That stuff was missing up until very recently, so that made it really hard for people to move or migrate from Amazon to GCP. Now that we've got that, that makes it a little bit easier. And let's see. I think that's about it, but I would encourage you to kind of take a look at a lot of this stuff. On the compute side of things, we've got a couple things I wanted to just mention. It's not, we don't have this integrated in ManageIQ yet, but maybe down the road, it's something we could consider. We do a lot with what we call managed infrastructure. So we have, you can spin up groups of machines that are all homogeneous, and then on the back end, we will make sure those things are up and running for you all the time. We also have autoscaler, so you can configure these things programmatically. So you don't have to worry about scaling your virtual machines up and down as long as they're part of this managed instance group. So those are ways that we can help kind of like scale out your service without a lot of hands-on effort on your part. And then if you tie that in basically with the work that Joe did, like with ManageIQ, if Google Compute Engine is spinning up new machines as part of an auto-scaled managed instance group, ManageIQ will pick those up automatically because of the event system and PubSub integration that he did. I think that's all I'll talk about on that slide. Compute Engine, a couple goodies that I wanted to talk about. Again, I won't go through every little gory detail, but live migration is another feature that we have that just you get for free. It's we expose, you can disable it if you want, but I don't know why you would. You know, all of this stuff runs on physical machines right in our data center. And like any other provider, right, or any other physical machine, it'll break and die and go down. We have the ability to, behind the scenes, detect that or preempt it and move your machine, your actual virtual machine, live. And you'll get like maybe just a little quick brownout. It might be like if you were to disconnect an Ethernet cable and plug it back in is about all you would notice. And then that just happens automatically. Another way that we sort of like stand out, I think, from some of the other cloud providers is on the cost side. So we have per minute billing. There's a 10-minute minimum, but after that, if you terminate your instance, you're no longer paying for it. So it's great for these little like batch workload kinds of things where, you know, if you only have a job that you're going to leave running for 15 minutes, you're not paying full 4 hours worth of usage. We also have what we call sustained use discounts. So this is kind of like, I think it's reserved instances probably if you're from Amazon world. On our side, you don't have to like pre-purchase these things. There's no contract. It's just if you have a virtual machine that's up and running, it gets cheaper over time. So during an entire billing cycle, which is a month period, if you were to leave that machine up and running the entire time, you'll end up getting 30% savings. And you haven't had to like, again, sign a contract or put in any kind of reserved, use that reserve stuff. Preemptible VMs is another feature where you can save on costs. If you have workloads that you don't necessarily care if those VMs are going to like bounce once in a while, but they'll come back. Preemptible machines allow you to save even more on cost, and so every once in a while these things will occasionally die and then come back. And that's based off of internal how Google does things. We have a lot of jobs that we run overnight or weekends or off-peak hours that we don't care if those things get preempted by something that's higher priority. So like a MapReduce job is a good, a good use case for that. Custom machine types. So we also have, discrete machine sizes, 2 core, 4 core, 16 gig, 32 gig. But we also have customized sizes. So you can sort of have little sliders and you can say, well, I want, like 32 cores, but 2 gigs of RAM, which isn't really going to help you. But you could like get around and do things like that if you wanted to. So you can kind of model this based on your own use patterns. Fast and consistent, so spinning up a VM on, regardless of size or whatever, gives you like about less than a minute to be able to SSH into the box. It's usually about 30 to 40 seconds before we'll tell you the machine is up, and that's when the OS is kicked in, but then it takes a few more seconds before SSH will come up and generate keys. Google's network, I mentioned this before, right? All of this stuff runs on top of the same infrastructure that we use to power all kinds of massive services. And that's pretty much it. I think we're wrapping up a little early, so we'll have time for questions. But I would encourage you to, like Joe said, please get involved. We would love to work with you to build out GCP support and ManageIQ even more. And you can go here for a free trial to get started. And you know how to find both of us, either on GitHub or we're on Gitter as well, that kind of thing. So that's it.
You mentioned auto-scaling groups, being able to auto-scale those nodes. I was wondering, and excuse me for my ignorance, but do you guys have some kind of like heat template support or some kind of YAML file that you can pass some of that information? Because right now, today, we've got, see, with OpenStack Heat, and we've got AWS Cloud Formations. What is GCE coming out with?
Yeah, so the question, well, I guess I don't have to repeat the question, you had the mic. We have a product we call Deployment Manager, which is probably the closest equivalent we would have to Cloud Formations, AWS Cloud Formations. So you could use that as an option. The other option, you know, ManageIQ, Red Hat, Ansible are all sort of like one and the same, kind of coming together as a family. I mentioned we do have support for some GCP services within Ansible, so that would be another way that you could look at doing. Although auto-scaling and managed instance groups is not yet available in Ansible, it's an open source project, and I would welcome contributions to help make that better. So, and will it be available in ManageIQ? I don't know. Joe, what do you think? Okay, Joe says he's actually got some code working for that. No, I don't know.
Other questions?
Just a quick one. Any plans of supporting nested virtualization within the Google Cloud Engine?
So nested virtualization, we're thinking about it. I think there's a lot of questions that have come up over the time, I guess the last couple of years about that. I would actually ask for contact information because we have some product managers right now that are looking at that and trying to like understand sort of use case requirements. So it would be great to get that information from you. If there's anyone else interested in nested virtualization, please get in touch with me. I would love to collect those use cases and pass that on to the product team. Other questions?
Yeah, so I have read recently about Google Stackdriver, and I see some feature overlap with what we have here. So I would like to ask about that. What's the goal of this? Is it like for moving people from Amazon, or what's the placement of the product?
So I think with Google Stackdriver, that was an acquisition that we made a year or so ago, and we just added. I think they just announced like capabilities to be able to manage both Amazon and Google from the same product. Where that fits in with ManageIQ, you're already sort of looking at doing that with the metrics, right?
Yeah, the events actually. So the events that we pull in on that event page that I showed you, those are from Stackdriver. So you enable Stackdriver logging on your project, and then you can just start logging every API call that comes in. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, we're around for the next couple of days. So.
Thank you.